So we're going to start working with React. Okay, it's important to realize that all React is a library. Okay, it's actually two libraries that we're going to work with: the React library and the React DOM library. And they're basically libraries that, given the state of an object, will generate the HTML for it. Sound familiar? Right? It's what we've been doing for 3 or 4 applications at this point. So we want to use React. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to touch an index.html file. I'm going to open it up. And we're going to do sort of the bare minimum that we need to get started with React. So we learned a little bit about third-party libraries, and React is really nothing more than a third-party open source library. Right? It was created by Facebook to solve a problem of having applications where you've seen, using vanilla JavaScript, there's a lot of different ways that we could end up building stuff. And we get into that cycle of having state and having data and making the changes, and it's tricky to sort of keep those things in sync. And React sort of has a one-way process. Here's the state. Here's what you end up getting from it. If you want to change the state, and you get a new HTML object or new markup, basically. So what we're going to do here is we're going to bring React in, and the easiest way to bring React in is to search for React. And one of the first things that comes up is getting started. And I always, by the way, you can just, if you wanted to, you just click on, do a search for React CDN, and you'll get to the same thing. But I'm going to go over here, add React to a page in 1 minute. And if I scroll down here, I'm going to see these 2 scripts. And I'm going to take these scripts, and I'm going to put them in the head of my document. Now, React needs a starting point. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to give this an ID of root. Now, I'm going to put my script tags in another file. So I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to put in script source, and this is going to be my app.js. And I'll go over here, add an app.js. I could put a console.log, hello world, just to see if that shows up. And let's open this up. And if I open up my console, I should end up seeing the hello world. Okay? And I have actually some messages from React. React is saying, hey, look, maybe you want to download these dev tools to use React. Well, let's just not really worry about that stuff at the moment. But this is actually coming from the files. What we're going to do here is, first of all, let's just see what we have. If I type the word React, so the way that these CDNs work is that when we have those files there, okay, when we have those files there, we have access to these objects. Very important, by the way. Order is important. If we go over here and I move this up here, I'll get an error, okay? So one of the things that JavaScript doesn't like is if you pull variables out of nowhere, so you get an error. This doesn't exist, uncaught exception. So the order is important. And we'll go over here, and let's also look at something else that we have. So there are 2 libraries, React and React DOM. And we're going to use both of those libraries. So what we're going to do here is, first of all, React needs a place to start out with. And I'm going to grab my document query selector, and I'm going to put in root, and I'll console.log root. And if I do that, I'm going to see that I have nothing. Okay? Reason I have nothing is that I've got my script tag up here. So one thing I could do is that I could say to my script tag, hey, look, defer yourself. Don't run until after the DOM has loaded. Two ways I could handle it. Either I could put this script on the bottom of the page, or I could put it on the top and tell it to defer. And now if I do this, I'll see that I found my root element. Okay? First thing I always like to do with React, the easiest thing, is I'm going to ask my React DOM to render. The only thing that React can render is React elements. Okay? React can only render React elements. React can't render regular HTML. The output is going to be regular HTML, but they have to be specific React elements. So I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to put in React create element, and I need to give it a name of a tag that it's going to recognize in the DOM. Okay? It knows the DOM tags that are available. I also have to give it a place to land. You want to render this, where do you want to render it? Okay? And you could see I've got my horizontal rule. Applause at the end, please, because it's going to go really slow if you guys keep on doing it as I'm showing you this stuff. It's important. So here, right, you look at this and go, all right, well, that's kind of silly. What's the big deal here? You have this ability to render an HR. That's not all that helpful here. The thing is that the React, what it's doing is that there's basically this React DOM and there's your DOM. And one of the things that React is very good at is saying, hey, look, this is what should be rendered in your DOM from some state, okay? And you change the state, and this is the DOM that should be rendered now. And React is very good at a diffing algorithm. It's very efficient, okay? With what we've done so far, we've just said, hey, look, state change, just render the whole thing, okay? And that's fine. Not all that efficient. We probably wouldn't end up seeing a difference unless we ended up having a lot of data on the page. But that's really what React is good at. Now, we could also go in here, and we could also make this a div. So create element takes, very important, create element takes 3 properties, okay? It takes the tag. It takes the props that you want to send to the tag. You could think of these as the attributes that you want to send the tag, okay? It also ends up taking the children. So we could go over here and we could put in create element, and I'm not going to put any props here, so I'm going to make this null, but I'm going to put in the string hello world, right? And it's going in, and you can see it's rendering this div that's over here. So if I was to go over here, and let's say I put in a class. So let's bring in, we looked at our Bootstrap library. Let's actually bring in that CDN as well. Right, as we're doing this, we'll do a little bit of Bootstrap. So I'm going to take this. Never hurts to type this stuff in. Link. Style sheet, href. And if I do this, I'll see a different font here, okay? So what I could end up doing here is if I went over here, I could give this a class. Let's look at our documentation for Bootstrap real quick. Bootstrap Alert. So these are the alerts for Bootstrap, and it's showing us what the classes are here. So we've got an alert, alert primary. So I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to put class. Okay? So this is an object, regular JavaScript object. And I'm going to make this alert, alert primary. And I get this beautiful blue bar. I could do an alert success. All right? Now, one of the things that I'll get here is a warning. Okay? It's a warning. It doesn't like that you ended up using the word class. Why do you think maybe it doesn't like the word class there? I assumed it would error out, by the way, first time I looked at this the other day. I just know I'm not supposed to use class. But class is a reserved word, right? So it's not good to use a key. That's why it's actually popping up here. It's not breaking anything, but it would much rather you put in class name. Now, this works the exact same way. Nothing prevents us from building this thing out a little bit and maybe making this the container class. Container class gives us a little bit of room on either side. So we've got a little bit of a, it's not smack up against the edge. If we make this bigger, we'll say we get a little bit more margin here. But what if we wanted to put an alert within this? Well, one of the things we could do is we could go over here and we could nest another React create element. This could be our div. Over here, we're going to end up putting in our class name, which is going to be alert, alert success. And we could go over here and put in, let's see if our parentheses match up, which they don't. So let's take a look. Here is this. Maybe it wasn't our parentheses. Let's see. Okay. I think it's okay, I think. Could be wrong. Okay? So now we get our alert within this container. By the way, if this makes you dizzy, it's okay. It should. Nothing would prevent us from going over here and taking all this stuff out. Here's our alert. By the way, alert's also a keyword. I'll just call it alert. And doing this, maybe it's a little bit more maintainable there. Of course, you could go over here. Let's call this alert success. Let's call this alert failure. And we'll go over here, and this is going to be goodbye world. Depressing. We'll make this warning. So we've got alert success. So you could put as many children as you want here, okay? You have to start off from somewhere. You have a React create element. You have your props. Add as many children as you want. By the way, those children can have children. So we could go over here. We could say alert success, alert failure. Now we've got both of these. We could even make it a little bit more dramatic. By putting in danger. Okay? Also, nothing prevents us from adding event handlers. Let's say we wanted to add some event handlers. So you can end up adding event handlers right on the properties. And I could go over here and I could put in an on-click. And I could define this on-click as an object by going in here. Sorry, that was incorrect. On-click, I could go over here and put in some object here. And if I went over here, our standard EV, console.log EV, I could do that. This is on my success. And I'll see that I've got my event object. Okay? So nothing prevents you from adding event handlers to this. And you might think, if we look at it, You know, early on when people were developing JavaScript, they would put their on-click event handlers directly on the elements. And sometimes you see people that sort of came from that time period will still do that, okay? And years back, it sort of got frowned upon because the idea was, hey, let's separate out our HTML from our functionality. Let's add the event handlers later on. Let's put all of our behaviors later on. So you might look at this and says, aren't you jumbling all these things together? And to some degree that you are, but again, it's not like it shows up on the DOM as an on-click event. But it is wired up. I mean, if you think about what's going on under the hood, right? You think about what's going on under the hood. What is probably happening here is that we're doing some document create elements, right? We're adding some event listeners to it. We're appending children to different elements of the DOM. Whatever it is. And you could probably look at it. It's probably somewhat understandable to figure out what's going on there. For all we know, it's building a big string and doing the same thing we ended up doing, okay? But you could also just look at it as a black box and say, I don't really care, okay? I just want the DOM, the elements to show up, my UI to show up the way that I want it to show up. Now, this could get a little bit tedious here, and maybe what we want to do instead, let's comment this out. And what if we wanted to do something along the lines of saying, hey, look, I don't want all this stuff here. There's got to be an easier way for me to separate out my code. And maybe what we want to do instead is go over here and do React create element app. Okay? App doesn't exist at the moment. If I go to run this, I'll get an exception because app doesn't exist. Now, what React is going to do when it sees that, okay? React is going to go and it's going to look for a function called app, and it's going to attempt to call it, okay? It's going to try to call that function. I could put the function in. Now app exists, and I get an error message, okay? And it's a very React error message. It's saying, hey, look, you told me this was create element. All React cares about is creating elements. All it cares about is the DOM. If you gave me a function, you better return something from that function. I could make that error go away by going over here and saying return React create element, and I always do this. My starting point, put in that HR, and that message ends up going away, and somewhere here there is an HR, okay? Nothing would prevent me from going over here, taking this code, taking this code over here, as long as I return this, right? So I have the ability to compose my HTML, okay? It's very wordy. We're going to find out a way to make it a lot less wordy at some point, but it's important to understand this is how React works. So now if we end up doing that, we're returning our element, we're back to where we were, okay? Well, we might want to do something along the lines of, just for the sake of argument here, you know, maybe we want to call this with different messages, okay? So maybe we've got an alert message, and maybe we've got a danger message. So maybe we want to call this, and we want to pass in success and failure. And we want to go over here, and one thing we could do is that we could actually give default values. So we could give a default value of success. And we could give a default value of failure. Okay? So this is a couple of things here that we can do. This is it's either ES6 or ES5, the ability to destructure what we pass in there, and if we don't pass it in there, these will be the default values. So let's see if this breaks anything. It doesn't, and let's try to use it by going in here and putting in success and putting in over here failure. Now, it's very interesting here because you might say to yourself, hey, when I called that function, I didn't pass anything. How did it get that? How did that happen? Right? How is it destructuring something? Anyone think about that when they saw that? At all? You should have. But maybe you didn't, because one of the things that you realize is that we're not calling this function. We don't call this function. React calls this function. Okay? React calls this function, and just to sort of let you see this, I'm going to go over here. I'm going to comment this out for a bit. I'm going to put it back in again. Just so I can get this to work. Again, I don't call this function yet. We're back with our HR. Yet, if I end up putting something here, I can call this whatever I want to call it, but these are called props in React. It's an empty object. You ever hear that expression, giving props? That's where this came from. Okay? So it's important because really think about it for a second. You might, when you look at functions, usually when you see functions, you call the functions. Okay? But we're not calling this function. We're telling React to create an element, it calls the function. So I'm just using destructuring here to destructure this. And let's actually take advantage of the fact that we could end up sending this message. And how could we send it? How do we send props? So here for success, we could put in welcome. And we'll see welcome. And we could go over here, and for failure, we could say, did I do that already? Is that my standard? No. Goodbye. Okay? So that's how we can end up passing props in here. Now, let's just say for the sake of argument, I'm going to take this data. How are you? It's pretty good, right? You like it so far? How are you? Sleeping back there. Can't see his face. He wants me to add something in, but I can't really see him. Okay, so what I want to do here, let's just prove a little point here. I'm going to take this, and I'm going to call this object equals this, and I'm going to pass it. Still works the exact same way, right? After this ends up rendering, I'm going to say object success equals hi there. Nothing. What if I put it up here? Works, right? What am I showing you here? What I'm showing you is that nothing changes in a React application without state. Okay? I have props here. I'm passing my props in. I'm changing this object, by the way. I'm changing it. And still, nothing happens. So React doesn't look and say, oh, wait, you use this object for your props. I saw that it changed here. I'm going to go and re-render it. It doesn't do it. Okay? React will use props. Okay? But if you don't have state somewhere in your application, nothing is going to change. Okay? Now, we don't have state anywhere in our application. How do we get state within our application? Well, the way to do that is this is what we call this type of component. We call it a presentational component. Okay? It takes in props and it gives us back some React. Okay? It's incredibly predictable. Okay? Whatever goes in, we can figure out what's coming out. Okay? You put in different messages, very predictable. Okay? These are pure functions. Whatever ends up coming in, we can determine what ends up coming out. These are great, but there's no state that's associated with them. So what we could do, we could switch this a little bit, and what we could end up doing here, let's comment this out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little bit of destructuring. So either I could do this. I could say component equals React component. So React has something called a component under it, which is going to allow me to create classes in React. And I could do that, but there's a little bit of sugar on the language that instead of doing this, and I think you guys have probably done this already, to say const component equals React. And what we're going to do here is that we're going to create a component. And in order to create a component in React, you name it as a class. And if you want it to be a React component, you have to have it extend component. Because this is what gives this component a lot of the functionality. This is one of the few times where you're going to be using sort of any object orientation in this class to some degree, creating your own classes. Probably one of the few times that you really have to do it. Okay? And again, the reason why we do it is that when we end up creating this object, there's actually a prototype object that now has some methods to it. Now, if I just did this, I'm going to get a different error message. And the message is going to be, hey, look, you know what? You told me you're a React component, but you don't have a render method. So let's put in a render method. If you haven't done a lot of classes, it takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's not the hardest thing in the world. One thing that's important is that you declare it, you put a block in here, and you put your methods here, name of the method with parentheses. If I just did that, I'm going to get this message that says, hey, look, you didn't return anything, and I'm going to be back in business if I take all this stuff and move it in here, and I'll be back in business with what I had before. The only problem here is I want to access my properties. The way that I can end up accessing them is this is the first time where you're going to end up seeing the word this. Okay? We never had to use this before. You can't use this in a functional component. By the way, how come you can't use this in a functional component? You can't bind with the arrow syntax. There's no this that's of any meaning. Okay? The only this in here would be the window object. It would point to the window object. This is not all that helpful. But if I want to get my props, what I could do is I could say, hey, look, get success and failure and get it from this dot props. Again, just a little bit of destructuring here. Okay? Again, I've called this. I've sent my props in here. Success is not defined. I spelled it wrong. Okay? And I'm back in business. Now, let's talk a little bit about state. This is kind of a silly example. Let's modify a little bit. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to take out what I'm passing in here. I'm going to clear this out, do something a little bit different. What I want to do is I want to set up my app to have some state. So I'm going to put in a constructor because, again, we don't call this, okay? We don't call this, but this will end up getting called by React create element. And if there's a constructor, that constructor will end up getting called. The constructor is where you end up setting the state. So what I could do here, and if I just did this, by the way, I'm going to get an error message. And the error message is going to say, hey, look, you know something? You extended from another component. Okay? When you extend from another component, there's a rule. And the rule is you have to call super. I forget whether or not that's a rule that React puts in, or even if we were doing our prototype inheritance with JavaScript, whether we'd run into that same issue. I'm not sure of the answer. Could be something that you just have with the ES6 classes. But in the end, it's telling us to call super. We'll call super. We'll make this message go away. And what I'm going to do here is let's do something a little bit different here. Let's go over here and let's create, we'll put on our state. The state has to be set as an object with keys and values. Your state can't be an array. It's got to be an object. Okay? And we're going to put in here items. We're going to make it an empty array. Reason why we're going to make it an empty array, what we're going to end up doing here is I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say my list items, and I'm going to say this dot state dot items, I want to map over you. And for each item that I end up mapping over you, I want you to create an element. I want it to be a list item. I'm not worried about the properties, but within that list item, I want you to put in the item. And our items are just going to be strings. Okay? And in fact, if I went over here, I could put some values in here. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to return React create element unordered list, null, list items. So one of the things that I could also put in as children is a collection. React doesn't mind when I do that. It says, that's fine. If your child is a collection, I'm going to render it. I have no problem rendering a collection of React elements. Okay? What's the length of this collection? 0, right? But if I go back over here, I'm going to be fine. If I go and I look at the DOM, I'll see my empty unordered list here. Okay? And I'm going to go over here, and I'll put in the string foo. Now, I see foo will end up showing up here. I'm going to go over here and put in bar. I'll see bar ends up showing up here. Okay? I'm going to do something a little different here. When my component mounts, there are some lifecycle methods in React. Okay? Lifecycle methods that end up getting called because when I use create element, and this shows up on the DOM, component did mount will end up getting called. Okay? It's going to get called because I extended from the component class. And if I console log this, I'll see mounted. And I'm going to go over here. And I have a little bit of a warning message. We'll talk about that now. So the warning message says, hey, look, you know what? I'm React. Okay? I'm going to keep track of this collection. So if anything changes, I know how to do it efficiently. Give me a key so I can identify these items. It also gives you this warning message. Well, the items might not be unique, right? I could put foo bar foo. So I don't want to use the item as a key. But this is a plain old map method. And so what do I know is going to be unique? The index is going to end up being unique. And so I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to get that message to go away by putting in here key is IDX. And this message will go away. Okay? What I'm going to do here is I'm going to console.log this.state. And I'll see my items, and there are 3 of them. And I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to say, well, this is great. Let me take my state and say this.state.items, and let me push a baz here. So I'm going to change my state. I got 4 items here. Nothing. Okay? So when I say that React goes by state, it's not that you change the object. You have to be very explicit with React. React has a method. If you're a component, you have a method called setState. And you could set the state to whatever you want to set it to. So I could go over here and put in this set state. And you have to set the state to an object with keys and values. And so I'm just going to go over here, and I'm going to say, that's cool. Items, I changed the items. Once I end up doing that, I'll end up getting that. Okay? So the only way anything changes with React is to change the state. But you have to have something on the state to start out with. So for instance, this would be a big no-no here. First of all, this works. If I did this, I would get baz to show up. But what I don't want to do, I could also do this. That works too. I just set the items in the state to a new array. That works. Okay? What you can't do is don't go over here and take that out. What do you think is going to happen that I took that out? What am I trying to call map over? Something that's in the state. Okay? Now, what I always like to do is I like to destructure to make my life a little bit easier. So I like to pull out items from this dot state. And this way my code maybe becomes a little bit easier. And let's put this back here. And here, let's make this items. Right? Let's do something else here. Let's put a function here. Let's call this remove item. And if I want to remove an item, I'm going to pass in an index. And when I call this, I'm just going to say, hey, this is going to get good. Don't leave yet. It's going to get really exciting. No, I'm kidding. I'm just kidding. Go ahead. So I'm going to do items. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say this.state.items. And I'm going to filter what I have. Okay? I don't care about the individual item itself. But don't forget, I'm passing in IDX. So I don't want to call this IDX again. And I'm just going to say, hey, look, I want you if your IDX is not equal to the IDX that I passed in here. And once I end up changing, getting this new array, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this.setState items. Now again, this is really doing items items. Remember, we spoke about this before, okay? But again, we call this syntactic sugar. We don't have to do items, because if you have a variable, it'll basically use that key for that variable, okay? We're not calling this, by the way, right now. We're not calling it. Let's go over here. I'll refresh it. Nothing's going to break, but let's call it. So let's put an on click here. Again, these are just objects. So we're going to do on click, and when we call it, we're going to end up calling it. When we call it, we're going to call remove item, and we're going to end up calling it with the index that we ended up passing in. So very often, you're going to end up generating a DOM that has the ability to change the state, and you'll end up changing the UI. So now if we refresh this, this will end up working, okay? This is about the extent for the intro that I want to do here. There's a workshop where you're going to be using the Faker library, okay? You're going to generate some favorites. You're going to use that as your state. And when the user clicks on it, you're going to toggle whether they're your favorites. And again, don't forget, if you're looping over something, you can always conditionally put in a class name on it by using the props. So that's kind of what you're going to end up doing now.